Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Vraks. With a brand new Supreme Commander of the 88 Inquisitorial Siege Army is preparing his very first major offensive, and it is looking like a remarkably optimistic one. Whether or not history will remember it as a bold maneuver or a foolhardy one will depend almost entirely upon the actions of the 30th Line Corp, who has been ordered to close the easternmost side of the battlefield and complete the encirclement of the Vraksian citadel. To do this, they will have to fight their way through the worshippers of the Plague God, across territory pitted and scarred by lengthy artillery bombardments and repeated deployments of chemical and biological agents. And upon the successful conclusion of the 30th Line Corps' offensive, the 1st and 46th Line Corps are to carry out their own offensives, crushing any remaining enemy positions outside of the curtain walls and moving both formations up to the very base of the walls, from which they will then launch future offensives aimed at breaching them. It all sounds so very simple. Like so many previous plans on Vraks, all it will really require to succeed is for the enemy to be cooperative. Unfortunately, the Vraksian defenders have a habit of being somewhat obstinate when it comes to fulfilling the desires of Imperial High Command, and whether or not they will be any more forthcoming with an inquisitorial opponent, that is a question yet to be answered. And in the case of a plan like this, the answer had best be in the affirmative, for this was most certainly a bold move on behalf of Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex. If the forward momentum of the 30th Line Corps was to be halted, or even worse, reversed, it could leave the flank of the 1st Line Corps entirely exposed, with only a single siege regiment standing between the forces of the Plague Father and a complete encirclement of the 1st Line Corps. And with the 46th Line Corps also fully engaged in their own offensive operations, there would be virtually nothing in the way of reserves for the 1st Line Corps to call upon, should the worst case scenario happen. I imagine the Death Corps commanders, upon receiving their orders, would have rather mixed feelings about the whole thing. On the one hand, it would certainly allow them plenty of opportunity to sacrifice themselves in the name of the Emperor, the ultimate goal of any Death Corps guardsman. But on the other hand, futile sacrifice was not in the service of anyone, and least of all the God Emperor, and this plan carried with it a substantial risk of futile sacrifice. They would at least be given a period of time with which to prepare the offensive, and they had best use the time well since so much relied upon it. They did, however, receive one further bit of instruction from the now Inquisitorial Supreme Command Structure on Thracia Primaris, and this was going to prove to be a considerably more controversial order. The 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army was to cease all large-scale offensive operations until preparations for the 30th Line Corps' general advance were completed. The army as a whole would limit itself only to small nuisance raids, patrols, and the occasional intelligence-gathering missions. No offensives were to be authorized. There would be no attempts to conceal the real aim of the general offensive, there would be no attempts to launch diversionary offensives, and no attempts would be made to draw enemy reserves away from the 30th Line Corps' area of operation. This decision would undoubtedly have drawn a considerable quantity of grumbling from the Death Corps officers if it were not for the fact that their command bunkers now also housed inquisitorial personnel. But I feel quite confident in suggesting what they must all have been thinking, that this was essentially giving the enemy carte blanche to relocate, reconstitute, rest, and refit their troops to their heart's desire. With no spoiling attacks and no pressure being exercised upon them by the Death Corps of Krieg, the Vraxian defenders, along with Nurgle's followers, would be at liberty to move and mass their troops wherever they wished. If they should somehow divine the focus of the next Imperial offensive, then the men of the 30th Line Corps would be in for a slog, the likes of which might even make their above-ground training regime back home on Krieg look positively comfortable. But it is not a Death Corps guardsman or even an officer's lot to reason why. Theirs is but to do or die. And so, on 27/38/27 Millennia 41, the 263rd Siege Regiment of the 30th Line Corps of the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army began to move out of their trenches and into no man's land. On the first day, only the 263rd would begin their advance. They would be joined the next day by the 262nd, then the day after that by the 269th, and then finally, on the fourth day, by the 261st. The idea was that the gradual commitment of the 30th Line Corps would see the front swing like a door, all the way up to the enemy's curtain walls, crushing all resistance in front of it. The 263rd would not have to attack entirely alone, however. They would also be assisted by the tanks of the 7th. The siege regiment would also receive inquisitorial support, but they would not be deployed on the first day. The Inquisitors would hold back until each individual Inquisitor thought it was time to commit his own forces to the fight, and none had volunteered to lead the assault on the first day. For the guardsmen of the 263rd Regiment, this would be a slightly unusual assault. Due to the enemy retreating after the breach of the curtain walls, the enemy had abandoned most of their outer defensive positions, and the area that the 30th Line Corps was to cross was almost entirely free of the kind of heavy entrenchments and defensive works that had been a bit of a staple of the war on Vraks so far. That was not to say that the area was undefended, however. The worshippers of Nurgle had turned almost the entire pocket into a large poisoned swamp. It was not quite as badly infested as the northern front that the 30th Line Corps had left behind, but it was still considered to be exceedingly treacherous terrain. And to make it worse, this was also an old battlefield. Not only had the 30th Line Corps launched some attacks in the area already, this was also the area in which the Vraxians launched their large-scale riposte to the 1st Line Corps after the breakthrough of the 1st Vraxian defensive line, all the way back during the starting years of the war. The terrain was littered in all manners of vehicle wreckage: tanks, APCs, transports, and trucks. It was also littered with the remains of the previous battle. Both sides had fired innumerable artillery rounds at one another, and during the more fluid phase of the battle, when the Death Corps was launching desperate counterattacks to check the Vraxian counteroffensive, they also laid thousands upon thousands of improvised minefields, scattered in a hurry all across the area to blunt the enemy's advance. This was done by both sides, and after years of laying inactive, nobody quite knew where the mines were anymore, nor if they were still alive, and even if they did know, the terrain had changed quite drastically since those early naive days of the war. And along with the various unexploded ordnance left behind by the countless artillery barrages, the terrain was far from safe, even if there was a distinct lack of enemy bunker positions spraying down the 263rd's advance. In fact, enemy resistance was so light to begin with that the regiment made very good time indeed. They cautiously picked their way over the broken ground, infantry squads supported by armoured elements, as the enemy began to respond. The first indication that there were enemies in the area at all came from scattered elements of heretical zealots. These groups were small and unorganized, often little more than ragged civilians with improvised weaponry and defensive positions, deployed not so much as a defensive line and more as a human early warning system. Their deaths and subsequent radio silence would inform their masters that something was awry. After overrunning a few dozens of these positions, the 263rd started to receive light and scattered mortar fire, which slowly but surely began to grow in intensity as heavier guns also joined in on the barrage. The regiment now began running into more concentrated pockets of enemies. These groups were still made up of the same poorly armed and armoured pseudo-civilian forces, but now the concentrations were larger. A few dozen members all packed into the same highly improvised and frankly amateurish shelters. They did not provide much in the way of obstacle for the hardened guardsmen of the Death Corps of Krieg. But as each new position was located, overrun, or otherwise destroyed, the enemy's barrage grew more accurate. The fiendish heretics were using their own men as little more than range-finding devices, trying to determine where the Death Corps' attack was at the strongest, and where the largest concentration of troops could be found. After overrunning several more of these positions, the enemy's barrage had grown considerably in its intensity. A constant hail of mortar, light artillery, and heavy gunfire was now raining down upon the 263rd, and soon thereafter, the uncomforting thump of heavy shells landing all around could be heard, except these were not explosives. The heavy, thudding impact into the soil was the telltale sound of heavy chemical shells impacting on the ground, quickly followed by the loud, shrill, hissing noise as the shells began venting their lethal cargo into the air. To begin with, however, the gas attack proved far more lethal to the defender than it did to the attacker. Protected by their chemically treated greatcoats and wearing sophisticated rebreather apparatuses with external oxygen tanks, the guardsmen of Krieg were virtually immune to the effects of the poison gas. For the defenders, however, the situation was quite different. If they were lucky, they were wearing surplus gear from the vast stockpiles of arms, armour, and equipment beneath Vraks. Such a uniform might even include a crude but relatively effective rebreather apparatus. For those who were not lucky, however, they would have to make do with whatever they could scrounge or improvise on their own, dressed usually in civilian-issue clothing with scratch-built protection. Their gas masks often amounted to little more than pieces of cloth draped across their mouths. It appeared as if the enemy had miscalculated, which seemed like an odd happenstance considering they had been at war with the Death Corps for over a decade. The defenders knew almost as much about the Death Corps' capabilities as the Corps itself, and even the half-maddened worshippers of Nurgle would be unlikely to make such a rudimentary mistake. And the reason for the initial poison gas attack was soon revealed. The first barrage took the form of a heavy, coloured gas that lay thickly on the ground. This gas proved entirely ineffective against the Death Corps of Krieg, but it did act as camouflage for a considerably more nefarious substance. Hidden by the thick layer of greyish fog, the TP3 gas was being pumped into the combat area. The TP3 gas was usually revealed by a ghoulish green tint to the fog, but hidden beneath the thick grey fog of the lesser gas, it was virtually invisible until it was all far, far too late. The specially treated uniforms and sophisticated rebreathers of the Death Corps offered some limited protection even against the TP3 gas. But since the guardsmen were not aware that they were being exposed to it, they had no way to react in time, and the first thing one would know about it was a stinging, burning pain in one's feet as the gas finished chewing through your boots. The surprise was complete. Even the Death Corps had not imagined this new, innovative way to deploy the TP3 gas. And by the time the 263rd realized what was happening and issued a general withdrawal order for the infantry elements, it was all too late for thousands upon thousands of guardsmen. In one fell swoop, the forward infantry elements had been virtually annihilated. Those not outright killed by the gas were horrifyingly maimed or incapacitated. The only elements still able to push forward were the armoured ones. The command structure of the armoured companies had anticipated some form of a gas attack, and all the vehicles had been equipped with brand new upgraded filtration systems, and their hulls had also been treated with chemical agents. This would grant them a considerably greater degree of resistance even to the TP3 gas. As long as one of the vehicles did not dump into a particularly thick concentration of the gas, or became stuck in one place for an extended period of time, it would probably be fine. It was still, however, far from safe. If the gas managed to wear its way through the links of a tank's tracks, for example, before it could escape the worst concentration of the TP3 clouds, then the tank would be left stranded in no man's land. And with no way to escape the gas on foot, the tank crew would be condemned to simply sit inside of their armoured sarcophagus and wait for the insidious substance to begin eating its way through their air filters until finally it entered the fighting compartment, after which each and every one of the vehicle's crew would be slowly melted alive until they were all nothing more than sludge at the bottom of the tank. But the TP3 gas was not the tank crew's only enemy. Now that the advanced infantry elements of the Death Corps had been so thoroughly dealt with, the enemy launched their own armoured elements in a counter-thrust. Although referring to what followed in such elegant language really does not do the battle justice. Both sides' armoured elements were quite literally blind in the thick, poisonous fog. The heavy grey gas had begun to dissipate and rise into the air, veiling the entire area into a lightish yet impenetrable wall of fog, whilst the thicker, greenish tint of the TP3 gas still covered all of the ground, and pooled thickly in old shell craters, forming greenish lakes of corrosive gas that promised death even to tanks. If a heavily armoured vehicle were to plunge into one of these lakes unaware, it would bury its front deep in the semi-liquid mud, and only a miracle would see the tank extricate itself under its own power. And with infantry being unable to operate out in the open for more than a few seconds without inviting certain death, there was simply no way to attach towing equipment to any stricken vehicles, leaving the crew inside as guaranteed casualties. The drastic drop in visibility also meant that the fighting was close in, brutal, and instantaneous. The first that a vehicle's crew would know of an enemy's presence was either when the bone-shattering impact of an anti-tank round slammed into their vehicle, or when a fog-shrouded form appeared in front of them, leaving the commander and gunner with precious few seconds to aim, identify if they were feeling particularly optimistic, and fire. Needless to say, many tank commanders did not feel that they had the luxury of the second step. And whilst the Death Corps of Krieg at the very least attempted to maintain radio contact with the other vehicles, and so figure out roughly where they were in relation to one another, it was far from a flawless system, and there were undoubtedly many cases of friendly fire on both sides. The tank commanders also had a further grisly choice to make. The TP3 corrosive gas, as we've talked about, eats its way through virtually anything, if just given enough time. Many of the Lehman Russ weapon systems were uncomfortably close to the ground. Hull-mounted and sponson-mounted weapons could only be fired with a certain risk that the barrel had been deformed or warped by the gas, risking serious misfire incidents if they were to be fired. Many Death Corps commanders simply emptied their secondary weapons of ammunition and sealed them away. They could, however, not seal away their main weapon. Most of the vehicles on the Death Corps side were Lehman Russ tanks, armed with the ever-trusty 120mm battle cannon. This weapon stood sufficiently far off the ground, mounted in a turret, to make it impervious to most of the TP3 gas. Nevertheless, many commanders chose to run with their guns at maximum elevation to ensure that none of the corrosive substance might get trapped in the barrel itself. Many others also chose to move without a shell in the chamber. This could cost precious seconds, both from lowering the gun and slamming around into the breach. But many considered that a superior alternative to carrying a 120mm shell around inside of the open barrel of the battle cannon. If even the slightest quantity of TP3 gas began to pool within, it could easily inflict enough corrosive damage to the shell to cause it to cook off whilst still inside of the gun, with predictably devastating consequences. It is not at all difficult to understand why, for the men of the 11th Tank Regiment, this particular battle was long remembered as the worst engagement in the entire conflict. And when the first day of offensive operations finally came to a close, the 263rd, or primarily the 11th Tank Regiment, had advanced 10 kilometers. This was not as good as hoped, but not as bad as feared, and so the offensive would continue as planned the next day, with the 263rd still supported by the 11th Tank Regiment continuing their advance, whilst the 262nd Siege Regiment on their flank began their own offensive. It had been hoped that the 263rd would have made more in the way of gains before the 262nd was added to the assault. But it was decided that fresh fighting power was needed, especially after the heavy casualties amongst the infantry regiments of the 263rd. The second and third day proceeded more or less like the first, with both siege regiments making modest gains against somewhat scattered and irregular opposition, mostly of a highly improvised nature placed more like human rangefinders than a real line of resistance. Despite this, the continuous heavy artillery bombardment, alongside scattered resistance and continuous gas attacks, exacerbated by the extraordinarily hostile environment through which the regiment had to move, meant that they could not make good gains. And on the fourth day, the nature of the resistance they were facing changed drastically. No longer were they pushing into positions held by disorganized and poorly equipped fanatical rabble. Now they were facing Chaos Space Marines of the Nurgle variant alongside their supporting armored elements. The Death Corps tanks had gotten used to pushing without infantry support, with most of their infantry now being cooped up in armored transport vehicles when they were not immediately needed to counteract enemy infantry, so as to better keep them safe from the occasional barrage of heavy gas shells. The tanks had also gotten far more accustomed to fighting in the near-zero visibility conditions of the gas barrages. The command vehicles had started moving up closer to the front line, establishing constant contact with the other vehicles in their squadrons and relaying the information about their position and status back to regimental headquarters. On their side, the regimental command staff maintained a near real-time, constantly updating chart detailing the position, engagement status, and condition of the various armored elements. All this information was then, on request, fed back to the various tank commanders, who could use this to keep a much better track of where their vehicles were in relation to their allies and potentially also their enemies. The tank crews had also come up with another, rather sneaky little trick. They mounted heavy stubbers on the top of their tanks, and had them remote controlled from inside of the commander's cupola. The commander would then, on occasion, fire the heavy stubber in a fan-like pattern in front of the tank. The brightly glowing tracer rounds could be seen zipping off into the fog for hundreds of meters, and if they suddenly started ricocheting off something, odds were that there was an enemy armored vehicle in the way. The tank commander would then begin hosing down that location, producing a continuous stream of ricocheting tracer rounds, helping the gunner to aim the main battle cannon and then fire it. This proved to be a very effective tactic, although not entirely without risk. The occasional firing of the heavy stubber created tracer rounds that could, of course, also in turn be traced back to the firing vehicle, and a particularly clever opponent might use that to locate the position of the Death Corps armor and destroy it first. Luckily for the 11th Tank Regiment, there were not a whole lot of clever souls in the ragtag armored bands that they had run into so far, made up primarily of Vraksian civilians with minimal training in armored warfare. But the things that they were fighting on the 4th day were far from amateurs, and the Nurgle Chaos Space Marines had seen practically every trick the galaxy had to offer, and they were very, very clever indeed. And to make matters worse, they were not limited, like everyone else, to operating only with armored vehicles during the midst of a TP-3 bombardment. Even such a vicious and destructive corrosive gas as TP-3 was not immediately lethal to the Plague Marines. It certainly was amongst the more dangerous elements on the battlefield as far as biological and chemical warfare was concerned, even for them, but that merely meant that the Plague Marines' time of operation in an area soaking with TP-3 was merely measured in hours instead of days. And in the low visibility setting of the current battlefield, a Plague Marine on foot had many advantages over a Death Corps armored vehicle. He was smaller, quieter, harder to detect, had superior helmet sensors, and could easily bring along more than enough firepower in the form of a melter gun, crack missile launcher, or las cannon to defeat even the heaviest armored vehicle, especially since the Plague Marine could easily get nice and close to his targets. Additionally, both siege regiments along with the tank regiment began reporting unusual encounters with things that were clearly not entirely of this world. One vehicle reported back to regimental headquarters that it had killed what appeared to be a giant slug. It had come barreling out of the fog and hit one of the vehicles in the squadron, quickly climbing on top of it and then beginning to melt it at incredible speed, the armoured hull of the Leman Russ running liquid in mere seconds. The screams of the dying tank crews were echoing over the intercom as the first friendly tank fired upon the slug. The first APHE shell impacted upon a sort of armoured carapace and detonated harmlessly. The second shell, however, hit the monstrosity in its soft, squelchy head, splattering it across the landscape and killing it instantly. But even though the engagement had lasted no more than 8, maybe 10 seconds, the Leman Russ it had attacked was an irrecoverable wreck. And the crew was still screaming. One of the hellhounds that had been brought up for anti-infantry support and protection against the plague marines turned its inferno cannon upon the tank and doused it and the crew in the cleansing fire of the Emperor. It was a mercy. Unfortunately, it was not the only encounter of such a nature on that day. Both siege regiments and the armoured regiment ran into repeated encounters with creatures that could best be described as universally unnatural, for that was pretty much their only defining and common feature. Some were about the size of a man, stumbling across the battlefield on too many legs and not enough arms. Others were the size of battle tanks. Some were amorphous blobs. Some possessed a vague resemblance to animal or plant life, albeit nothing native to Vraks. In the face of this new and disturbing resistance, the siege regiments ground themselves to a halt. The advance of both the 263rd and the 262nd could go no further. Which was very bad news indeed, because they had barely reached the halfway point of their expected advance. The decision was made to throw the 269th Siege Regiment into the fight as well. Hopefully, the addition of yet another siege regiment could knock loose the line and enable a further advance. On the morning of the 5th day, the 269th rose from their trenches and began to advance grimly into no man's land. They had heard the reports of what the other two siege regiments in the 30th Line Corps were facing, and they were not overly looking forwards to it themselves. Nothing can prevent a corps guardsman from making every sacrifice necessary, but even the men of Krieg have certain preferences in how they are to die, and the reports streaming back from the other two siege regiments were no one's ideal way of dying. And it looked like the 269th might catch a break. The enemy may have sent all of their reinforcements to countering the advances of the 262nd and 63rd. Perhaps the Inquisitor's plan had worked. Feeding the 30th Line Corps into the battle one siege regiment at a time could have drawn off significant enemy reserves. The defenders may have overreacted to the attack of the two previous siege regiments and left the area in front of the third wide open. Or at least so it appeared for several hours until, once more, strange reports began filtering back to regimental headquarters, although this time the reports were not of monstrous strange beings heaving out of the fog. In fact, the enemy had not answered with a barrage at all, conventional or otherwise. It was, by Vraxian standards, a clear day, and resistance had been extraordinarily sparse, virtually nothing beyond the occasional scattered picket line. But this was soon to change. The forward elements reported coming into contact with unknown hostile forces. They were not firing upon them, they were not charging them, they were barely making a conscious effort to attack them. At first, they thought they'd run into some shell-shocked elements, survivors of the previous barrage, but when the Death Corps opened fire on them, they wouldn't fall. It took an entire squad in execution formation, firing repeated volleys from their Lucius Patton lasguns to put even one of them down. And when the guardsmen thought they'd finally put one down for good, they occasionally got back up again. Their shambling, slow and uncoordinated movements didn't pose much of a threat to the Death Corps, but neither could the Corps really advance. Every time they wiped out one group of these plague zombies, another one would take its place, and that too would have to be destroyed virtually piece by piece, just for another group to appear almost immediately thereafter. Soon, the 269th had to report that they were being pushed back, by a seemingly endless tide of slowly shambling undead, wearing the uniforms both of the Vraxian defenders and of fallen Kree guardsmen. These reports finally got the attention of the Inquisition, and one of their number, a Thor Malkin, was dispatched to the forward headquarters of the 269th to assist them in dealing with this supernatural threat. There wasn't a whole lot the Inquisitor could do immediately, however, and on the next day, the 262nd and 263rd also reported that they too were now engaging what appeared to be the corpses of long-lost comrades and enemies alike. The offensive continued for 3 further grueling days, but no further advances were made. And after 8 days of near-continuous fighting, the operation was called off, with the regiment only having reached halfway through their planned advance. In a fit of peak frustration, the Inquisitors embedded in the siege regiments authorized the use of chemical weapons to be used against the Nurgle forces. A questionable idea, perhaps, but the Death Corps obeyed, and over the next few days they fired tens of thousands of gas canisters of various size and potency into no man's land, reducing entire sectors of the front line to little more than poisonous swamps, which would remain inhospitable, uninhabitable, and untraversable for centuries. With the failure of the 30th Line Corps to complete its advance, the Death Corps commanders now expected that the planned offensives that were to be launched by the 1st and 46th Line Corps would be called off. But any notions to that effect were soon dispelled, as orders came down from up above that the 1st and 46th would launch their offensives just as planned. The elements of the 11th Assault Corps that had been supporting the 30th Line Corps would be withdrawn to join up with the 1st Line Corps, and the 8th Assault Corps would be deployed to support the 46th Line Corps. The planned offensives would continue just as planned, regardless of the failure of the 30th Corps. Immediately, however, protests were raised by the commander of the 11th Assault Corps. He stated that the 7th and the 11th Tank Regiments, which had supported the 30th Line Corps, were both badly bruised and battered. He would need time to bring up replacement vehicles, to repair those that had been recovered, and to assign new tank crews as well. There were massive gaps in his formation, and he had to close them before he could consider the 11th Assault Corps combat effective once again. Taking this into consideration, Lord Inquisitor Hector agreed that the 1st Line Corps would postpone its offensive, but the 46th Line Corps, supported by the 8th Assault Corps, would launch their offensive at the set date, with or without the 1st. And this time, Lord Hector Rex also decreed his Inquisitors would not merely observe or partake, they would lead the attacks, starting with the 46th Line Corps on the set date of 40/08/27 Millennia 41. The 46th Line Corps had been given instruction to seize Height 202, a strategic rise in the land from which the Death Corps could oversee the entire northern-facing front of the Citadel curtain walls. If this area could be seized, enemy maneuvers could be observed at will. The enemy heavy guns on top of the curtain walls could also be engaged at will by heavy guns emplaced on Hill 202. And finally, the hill would be an excellent staging ground for further assaults against the Citadel walls. The first day of the offensive would see the 46th Line Corps steal a page out of Marshal Kagori's playbook. During the days leading up to the offensive, Death Corps engineers had been busy undermining the enemy's positions, creating several offensive mines running under and behind the enemy's positions. On the day of the offensive, the end of these mines were blown outwards, allowing Death Corps infantry squads to pour through the mines and out behind the enemy's positions, attacking them from behind. The Vraksians' forward lines were quickly overwhelmed, as they had been caught completely by surprise, and the 3 siege regiments of the 46th Line Corps advanced swiftly towards Hill 202 and to the right and the left of the position, to ensure that the enemy could not launch any counterattacks on the 468 Regiment's flank. That regiment having been given the honourable task of claiming the hill itself. It would, however, be an exceedingly costly honour. The ground in front of Hill 202 was virtually impassable, and the steep incline made it literally impossible for Krieg armour to support the regiment directly until the 109th Engineer Company had laid a temporary surface upon which they could drive safely. Up until that point, the armoured elements supporting the 46th Line Corps are nothing more than so many decorations, far out of range and unable to engage the enemy's positions. The only guns in the Imperial arsenal that could engage them were the long-range artillery of the Death Corps, but the enemy were solidly dug in on Hill 202. They realized that it was a vital position to hold, and that losing it would endanger the curtain walls, and so the entire hill had practically been hollowed out, with tunnels running up and down its length, and hidden bunkers and gun pits scattered all across its rugged surface. There were other weapons in the Imperial arsenal that may have made a difference as well, those of the Legio Astorum, but the Titans were kept in reserve. Whether or not this was requested to be so by the Imperial commanders or Inquisitors, or if Drauka simply had some doubts as to the Inquisitors' plans, we do not know. The only thing we do know is that the engineers of the 109th Company had to slave away under constant shelling and enemy gunfire for a full day, suffering exceptionally heavy casualties and virtually having the company wiped out in its entirety before it could lay down enough of a roadway for the tanks to support the further advance of the 468 Regiment. And even reaching the point where the engineers could be deployed, the regiment had also lost several companies, virtually shredded and now combat ineffective. On the eastern flank, the 469th Regiment had a little more success in pushing forward, but they too were unable to secure anything even remotely like a breakthrough. The enemy had easy access to reinforcements, and whenever the regiment sensed that it might be getting close to punching through one sector or another, the enemy simply poured in its reserves to halt them. Meanwhile, on the first day of the offensive, on the western flank of the main advance, the 470th decided to implement a somewhat novel first attack. The 468 was expected to make a rapid progress after their undermining efforts, as they indeed proved to do. The 470th having a longer distance to cover than both the 468 and the 469th, needed something big and impactful to break open the deadlock swiftly and allow them a quick advance. Everything the Death Corps had tried up until this point had not really been overly effective, but today's idea was a novel one. 7 companies of Death Riders were formed up behind the Death Corps front line, and then, in the early morning, they were moved up, lined up in near parade fashion, and ordered to charge directly towards the enemy's positions. No covering fire, no preliminary bombardment whatsoever. The 7 Death Rider companies would bet absolutely everything on one single hand, an overwhelming and complete element of surprise. And to be fair, it's not the craziest of idea. After all, the enemy had been under repeated artillery bombardment for months at this point. One more preliminary softening bombardment would hardly have shifted them, but it would have provided them with a certain degree of warning that the Death Corps may be up to something. But when done in this fashion, the only warning the Vraksian defenders had was when the ground started shaking ever so softly and they saw 7 full companies of Death Riders barreling down towards them. And honestly, if such an offensive had been carried out during the early days of the war, I damn well think it could have been a success. The shock and awe of this mighty sight of thousands upon thousands of cavalrymen storming towards your entrenchments, that may very well have been more than enough to scare the living daylights out of what was then amateur troops and mere PDF guardsmen. But sadly for the Death Riders, or happily, depending on how into the cult of sacrifice you are, this was not that enemy. Far too much time had passed, and the Vraxian defenders had seen some shit in the last decade or so. This was certainly a rather unique sight, but it did not prevent them from pressing down the triggers on their heavy bolters and stubbers. Nevertheless, the genuine surprise and speed of the attack did prove successful. The Death Rider companies did break through the enemy's forward lines, and followed up as they were by infantry regiments, it did indeed lead to a swift breakthrough of the outer lines. However, the 470th Advance stalled right in front of the second enemy defensive line. Nevertheless, such results were more than enough to be considered a resounding success on Vraks, although an exceedingly costly one. Out of the 7 companies of Death Riders, only 60 wounded men responded to roll call that night. No more perfect an example of the bravery of the men of Krieg could ever be presented, nor asked for. If the God Emperor ever considered employing Valkyries, they would have had rich pickings on that day. Not the only day either. The 46th Line Corp was carrying out its own little solo offensive against one of the strongest points left outside of the curtain walls. A strong point within easy supporting distance of said curtain walls. And they were launching this attack entirely unsupported. The reason why the enemy were able to throw so many reserves into the fight was that they were simply taking them from the neighbouring sector, the sector that the 1st Line Corps was supposed to be attacking. The commander of the 46th even went so far as to plead with Lord Inquisitor Hector Vraks to force the 1st Line Corps to attack because his own formation was bleeding itself dry. But the Lord Inquisitor would not relent. The 1st Line Corps would only attack once the 11th Assault Corps was fully prepared and organized. That finally occurred on 43-18-27 Millennia 41. The 1st Line Corps, along with the 11th Assault Corps, launched themselves towards the enemy, in front of them, between the curtain walls, and a push also to the east and south. Due to the failure of the 30th Line Corps to push the Nurgle worshippers far enough back, the flank of the 1st Line Corps was still severely exposed. But fortunately for all involved, the Inquisitor did not order the formation, or perhaps he left it up to their own devices, to attack with all strength towards the curtain walls, allowing the 1st Line Corps to break off enough forces to keep the Nurgle worshippers busy as well. The 1st Line Corps met with more success than the 46th. They were advancing into an area that had been relieved of a lot of its reserves to meet the offensive of the other Line Corps. Additionally, they did not have to take a commanding hill in their path. And so, finally, the Lord Inquisitor had something that was beginning to look like a success, and it appeared that it would be able to close the distance to the curtain walls and destroy any further resistance outside of them, whilst also inflicting a bit further damage upon the Nurgle worshippers, who responded in the usual fashion by drubbing the siege regiment attacking them with repeated chemical attacks. The response they received in answer to these attacks, however, was quite new and an order of magnitude greater than what I imagine they had expected. The Imperial Navy was finally called upon to shine once again. Over the preceding months and years, they had been slowly but surely wearing down the Vraxian Air Force. The Vraxians had always had a very limited access to air power, since all of it had been brought in from off-world during the time of the Chaos reinforcements, and their numbers had been dwindling slowly but surely during a continued aerial offensive by the Imperial Navy. And now, finally, the balance had tipped over to almost complete air superiority for the Imperials. It was now a decided rarity to see a Hellblade or Helltalon rise up to challenge the Marauder bomber formations of the Navy. The only threat now was the anti-air artillery on the Vraxian citadel walls and the citadel itself. But this time the Marauders were not required to bomb with any kind of precision. As long as the Navy's ordnance struck somewhere in the rough vicinity of the citadel walls, or out in no man's land occupied by the Nurgle worshippers, that was plenty. And so the Marauder bombers were allowed to fly at extreme altitudes, at which the enemy's air defenses found it very difficult to engage them with any sort of efficiency. Whilst the Marauders, in turn, simply dropped tens upon tens of thousands of tons of bombs upon the curtain walls and the areas occupied by the Nurgle worshippers, without even the pretense of aiming. Even an orc would be proud of such utter disdain of the art of marksmanship. Finally then, the situation was as follows. The Inquisitor's grand plan had not been anywhere near the success he had surely hoped for. The 30th Line Corp had not managed to squash the Nurgle worshippers in their pocket. They had only managed to take half of the land they had hoped to take, and that was it. In the process of doing so, the 30th Line Corp had been badly mauled, and elements of the 11th Assault Corps had also received quite the beating. Meanwhile, due to the fact that the 46th and the 1st Line Corps were not able to launch their offensives simultaneously, the 46th Line Corps and the 8th Assault Corps had also suffered exponentially more than they had ever needed to if the 1st had been able to support them from the get-go, or the Lord Inquisitor had simply chosen to postpone the offensive. Once the 1st finally joined, however, it made rapid and solid progress, even cutting into the Nurgle worshippers' territory as well. All in all, the offensive could not be said to have been a smashing success for now, but it did look like it would at the very least avoid a complete failure. Little, however, did both the Inquisitor and the Imperials know that the nature of their opposition was once again about to change quite drastically. The power structure on the Vraxian side was in for quite the transformation, the exact nature of which you will learn in next week's episode. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.